All right, hello, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we try to provide you with solutions to pressing problems. Every problem has a solution. They all have equations. You can figure them out and solve your problems. We try to do a lot of this through a lot of obscure works that you probably haven't heard of before, but if you did, they'd make a big difference in your life. Grand unified theories, all-encompassing theories, magnum opuses, tour de forces, and earth-shattering discoveries. And in particular, we've been looking at the New Testament of the Bible, doing Bible decodes. I believe this is number 214. And not an obscure, unknown source, but a pretty obscure interpretation vehicle in that we're using mostly the Roman origins hypothesis. The basic idea is that the Romans and the Jews fought a war from 66 until 73 AD. This was the culmination of over 100 years of constant revolt and riot and insurrection, aggressiveness, militancy from the Jews who were being colonized by the Romans, or under their yoke, under the yoke of the Romans. And the Jews always fought back, especially because they were quite separatist and xenophobic and strident themselves. They had rituals that they had to carry out, and they were willing to do so on pain of death. And this was super high maintenance for the Romans because the Romans governed dozens, hundreds of other nations in their empire. And the Jews took up an inordinate amount of their attention. During this war, the two main general commanders for the Romans were Vespasian and his son Titus. Vespasian from 67 to 70 AD, 69 AD, at that point, he became the new emperor, and he appointed his son Titus to keep the war going. Titus ended up utterly destroying Jerusalem and wreaking major havoc on the population of the Jews. Nonetheless, both Titus and Vespasian were wounded in the war, and they felt a strong need to do something to mellow out the Jews, to domesticate them, prune them, tame them, and also to get them to worship Titus and Vespasian as gods, with or without their knowledge of doing so. Now, this revolt in 66 AD that started the war was led by a number of kind of self-proclaimed Jewish messiahs, people that believed that they were the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies that were predicting a new Messiah in the first century that would help the Jews to overthrow the Romans. And so Vespasian and Titus, Vespasian the new emperor, and Titus, who will eventually become the emperor, decided to stage a psychological attack on the Jews. And that psychological attack was the Gospels. In particular, the Synoptic Gospels, starting with Mark, Matthew, and then Luke. Luke is probably their highest achievement of kind of improving it each time. But the Gospels were a psychological operation against the Jews in order to mellow them out and humiliate them in various ways. There is a lot of evidence for this, both material and circumstantial. The Gospels are written in Greek. The Romans were the only people who even had the means or the opportunity to have written the Gospels, unlike a bunch of illiterate apostles in Aramaic speaking in Judea. The Romans had a monopoly on publishing, distribution, and censorship. The Romans also had the very clear motive of trying to mellow out the Jews, along with to get the Jews to worship Titus in particular, and to humiliate the Jews in various ways. The Romans, this was exactly what they would do, right down the wheelhouse of the Roman MO. Create a religion for psychological purposes, and they did that in various other ways in the first century. But the textual evidence is even stronger. At the time that the Romans wrote the Gospels, they also wrote a history of the war that they just got done fighting against the Jews. So they wrote this history of the Gospels. They backdated the story 40 years. They wrote this War of the Jews, or otherwise known as Jewish War, under the name of Josephus, who may or may not have existed, but he was writing from Rome with the endorsement of the Roman Caesars, and was a family member by adoption of Titus and Vespasian, who are known as the Flavian emperors, along with Titus's younger brother Domitian. From 69 until 96 AD was the Flavian dynasty. Josephus is known as Flavius Josephus. And so his 7-volume history, War of the Jews, has too many uncanny parallels between it and the Gospels to even consider that they might have been written by different people. Whoever wrote Josephus' War of the Jews also wrote the Gospels at the same time, for the same reason, by the same people. The comparisons, the parallels are overwhelming. There is a set of parallels discovered by Joseph Atwill in his book Caesar's Messiah, where the 3-year ministry of Jesus is shown to be a replica of the 3-year military campaign of Titus in War of the Jews. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus also goes in the same order, and they encounter parallel events at each of 40 or 45 separate events in the same order, with the same events, but parallel, analogous events, and spaced apart by 40 years. Michael Menescot's, in his new book called Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult, looked deep into the book of Luke and pulled out an astonishing 250 parallels with the War of the Jews in a a book of Luke that's over 10 per chapter. The book of Luke is literally saturated with parallels from Josephus's War of the Jews. And some of them will knock your socks off. Not all of them, but some of them. Many of them. With their level of detail, intricacy, well-hiddenness, and just motif after motif. There, some of the parallels have 12 separate motifs that are analogous between the two stories, but you wouldn't even notice it if you weren't looking for it. And then he graphed out the 250 plus parallels, putting the book of Luke on the vertical axis and War of the Jews on the horizontal axis, putting a dot wherever there was a corresponding parallel, making 5 almost perfect letters in Latin, APTVS, meaning that the Romans not only did they write the book of Luke, but they put their initials on it, just to mock you for believing in such hogwash. Now we have looked at a couple of books that kind of skirt around the Roman origins hypothesis. There are at least 10 or 12 authors over the years that have written explicitly about the Roman origins hypothesis and determined, most of them that Titus and Vespasian were, the guilty parties. But this book here by Rosemary Sheldon and Thais Voskuilen looks at the Pauline epistles in particular, and they, for some reason, Jesus is utterly deferential to the Romans, and he is very disruptive of the Jewish rituals, almost as if he was commissioned by the Romans. And Paul is even more so. And so they noticed it with Paul, but they didn't notice it with Jesus. And so instead of coming up with a Roman origins hypothesis of like the whole New Testament, they restrict it to Paul, and they don't see it as being less conspiratorial, where they see Paul as being basically an intelligence agent of the Romans, like a spy of the Romans, who's there to kind of disrupt the nascent Nazarene movement, the followers of Jesus, led by Jesus's brother James and Peter. It cost them. I think it cost them not seeing the whole view, only seeing that Paul is a Roman agent and not seeing that Jesus is also a Roman agent. Both of them Roman agents by being fictional characters. Neither one existed, but they both contributed to the Roman, the idea that you should be deferential to Rome while rejecting the Jewish traditions and rituals, which were that was kind of like the main threat to the Romans. Is these crazy Jews, the Romans actually had to concede to the Jews because the Romans had a thing where they wanted to put a statue of Caesar in your place of worship. They had a pretty much an open freedom of religion policy of the people that lived under their umbrella, but they said you can worship your own God, but you have to put a statue of Caesar in your sanctuary or whatever. And they tried that with the Jews, and the Jews have this stricture against graven images, and the Jews were literally willing to go to war to avoid Caligula putting a statue in his Emperor Caligula. In putting a statue in his in the temple, And the Romans relented. So the Romans granted the Jews an exception to that, having the statue of Caesar in the temple. So all the other nations had to have it, but the Jews didn't. The Romans weren't willing to fight that battle. That shows you that how big of a pain in the butt the Jews were to the Romans. And, shows you a clear motivation that they would have had to try to use psychological techniques, psychological operations in order to mellow out the Jews. The Romans wanted the Jews to be good citizens, hardworking citizens, peaceful citizens, law-abiding citizens. And, incidentally, Christians of today are just that. That's what they got out of their New Testament. It's a mixed bag. It's a limited hangout. There's a lot of very valuable stuff in the New Testament, but it's in there to suck you in so that they can seize you with this docile, deferential, pacifistic thing, which is what they want from you. Now, I'm not, saying that you should just go out and kill your authority figures or whatever, but Christians in general have read a more aggressive posture into the scriptures, and so they still do have a degree of rebelliousness in spite of Jesus. Anyway, getting back into this Paul, we're about to start chapter 5, which is kind of the key episode of Paul's life. The incident at Damascus is the name of the chapter. And the first section is called The Persecution Spreads. Not content with his successes in Jerusalem, Saul planned to extend his activity to the cities of the Jewish diaspora, where members of the Jesus movement had fled in order to escape persecution. And you can see that in Acts 8:1, Acts 11:19. Saul went to the high priest and applied for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, authorizing him to track down and arrest anyone he found, man or woman, who followed the way, and to bring them back to Jerusalem. The book of Acts gives us the account of what happened to Saul on the way to Damascus, where he claims he had a vision of Jesus that ends what scholars commonly refer to as the pre-Christian period of Saul's life. This is how Acts describes it. Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" "Who are you, Lord?" Saul asked. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting," he replied. "Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do." The men traveling with Saul stood there speechless. They heard the sound, but did not see anyone. Saul got up from the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand into Damascus. For 3 days he was blind and did not eat or drink anything. Acts 9:1-9. And that is the basis of Christianity right there. That Paul's conversion is the beginning of the Christian, because he's their number one proselytizer. The phrasing in Acts suggests Saul's hatred toward the movement was a personal vendetta. But judging by the treatment of the Nazarenes in Jerusalem and the nature of the mission to Damascus, we can safely assume that Saul, the police agent, did not persecute them for personal reasons, but in the service of the authorities for whom he was working. Both the high priest and the Roman authorities shared a negative view of the nationalist, anti-Roman elements of the Jesus movement. According to the Gospels, both parties had conspired to kill Jesus. Whether they cooperated in hunting down his followers is unknown, but it is likely. After all, in the Gospels, it was the Sadducees who turned Jesus over to the Roman authorities for execution, and the Romans needed Jewish collaboration in hunting down seditious movements. From the fact that certain Nazarenes were hiding in Damascus, it can also be deduced that it was very dangerous for them to stay in Jerusalem. They might have suspected execution awaited them if they stayed within reach of the high priest or the Romans. Jesus was not at all safe for them. And now areas within reach of the Jerusalem police were no longer havens either. Saul was acting on credible intelligence that there were Nazarenes in Damascus and that a mission to infiltrate them was feasible. This would hint at the presence of at least one informant in Damascus who had the latest information on the status of the group's activities and the state of alert of the Roman authorities in Damascus. But really, if you read Acts, and it's been a while since I've read Acts, maybe I'll look at it again and maybe I'll find something more, but it seems to me that in the book of Acts, after, or even in the Gospels too, after the crucifixion, the rest of the disciples were like not in any kind of a panic to escape from the police. That they weren't concerned in the least bit about whether the police were going to come and get them. So, you know, it seems like they here very much overstate the kind of the threat that the Jesus movement, Jesus' apostles, that they represented, or just the whole movement, you know, that, okay, well, I can see that they want to execute Jesus because he's a kind of a chaos agent. But they made no attempt to come after anybody else because they're deferential to the Romans. They're not a threat. The only threat is the chaos. And that's kind of incidental. That's not, you know, Jesus says, you know, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and walk an extra mile with the Romans pack. So writing letters to diaspora communities was one of the high priest's duties. Such letters would have no formal weight since the high priest had no legal jurisdiction in Damascus, situated as it was in the Roman province of Syria. But his position would have lent authority to his requests. Herod the Great was the only sovereign we know of who was allowed the exceptional privilege of extraditing a fugitive from a state outside his jurisdiction. Yeah. If Caiaphas sent letters to Jewish synagogues in Damascus asking members to denounce the followers of Jesus, then this was a religious issue. If, however, Saul was sent there to capture dissidents in the name of the high priest and bring them back to Jerusalem, then this becomes a political act because it would be a violation of Roman sovereignty. Even if the Romans and the high priest agreed on what needed to be done, arresting citizens in Roman territory would be seen as a breach of the chain of command and would surely have caused political problems. Trying to get the Jewish community to unite for its own protection in Jerusalem was one thing, but kidnapping Jews in other cities was another matter entirely. If Saul were arrested by the authorities in Damascus, would the high priest disavow all knowledge of his activities? If these persecuted Nazarenes worked to further their cause by violent means, they might very well have been treated as terrorists. This would have given the Romans a good reason to send an agent like Saul to Damascus. And they do try to kill Paul, I believe. So, okay, we're at the end of this section. I think we can squeeze a little bit more in. This section is called Preparations. It is unknown how a team of agents was formed or whether it existed prior to this particular mission. It would seem preferable in this case to use a team of agents that had trained together and who knew and trusted each other's capabilities. Loyalty, perseverance, and dedication would be important character traits. All Acts tells us about the hierarchy within the team of persecutors is that Paul was carrying the instructions. From this, we can surmise that up to that point, Paul was an agent whose loyalty, dedication, and mental stability were not a matter of debate. What about the possibility of Roman involvement? If the Nazarenes had nationalist leanings, then the Romans would not want them in any city of the empire. It does not seem very likely that the Romans saw good reason to kill Jesus, but not even to monitor his messianist followers. The very idea that these followers were actively spreading their pernicious doctrines, possibly fueled by anger because of the death of their leader, would have been a matter of concern to the Romans. All Acts tells us about the preparation for the trip, however, is that Saul received unknown instructions from the high priest. These instructions remain a mystery. There is no mention of Roman involvement. But then, if this were such an undercover operation, secrecy is what one would expect. Such records are not kept for reasons of security, and one must have a plausible deniability in case the operation goes bad. The classic counter-espionage problem, in antiquity as well as in modern times, is that unlike any other crime, espionage leaves no trace, and proof is virtually impossible unless a spy either confesses or is caught in the act. Espionage is a crime almost devoid of evidence, which is why intuition, for better or worse, always has a large part to play in successful detection. As a former head of MI5 has pointed out, all a counter-espionage officer usually has when he confronts his suspect is a background, a trail, a set of coincidences which are open to a variety of interpretations, but which lead to an epiphany, that moment when all facts add up to only one conclusion. This is true of modern spies, but it is even more apt when we try to track down spies from 2,000 years ago. A group that is considered criminal by the authorities is highly motivated to prove that a police agent is among them. And the agent has to maintain a very good cover to prove he is a sincere convert. Trying to track either side is a tricky business. The failure of the operation in a neighboring province could cause just as much trouble for the Romans as it would for the high priest. So no matter who was running this operation, secrecy was of utmost importance. The author of Acts would have no knowledge of the operation, and even if he did, his reaction would be to obscure Saul's involvement in pro-Roman activities. Not so sure about that. Such is the continued misrepresentation in Acts that this entire scenario is turned into a conflict among the Jews. Acts begins a trend, later taken into the Gospels, that lumps all the Jews together and then blames them for whatever goes wrong. At the very least, the Romans may have been notified that the high priest was, quote, taking care of the situation in Damascus. Again, they get right there, they figure out that the Gospels and the epistles, of Acts and the Gospels, lumps all the Jews together and then blames them for whatever goes wrong and leaves the Romans blameless. Almost as if it was written by the Romans. Okay, we're going to stop right there. Please like, share, subscribe, comment, and come back tomorrow to see the adventures of Saul Paul and his career as an intelligence agent. Thanks for tuning in today. Have a